what we'd like to do with you is get maximum benefit from our guest, faculty, speaker, teacher. What I'd like to ask you, Jon, is how did you get started?
Well, first of all,
because we all have a story, right?
Yes, right. Before I get into the story, I just want to say that the picture that you paint is, of course, as you said, another story, but it's really quite compelling. So it's very enjoyable for me to simply bathe in the enormity of, this description of what might be or what is, and to think about it. And then I think the biggest challenge, which brings me back to the question that you asked, is like, well, okay, how do we operationalize this in the way we live our lives so that we're not just living up here in thoughts of entanglement that we are seriously entangled with without understanding any of it whatsoever, because this is complex stuff. So I was speaking actually on the podcast that I was doing with your team a bit ago, and it really, the way I got into this was in some sense, in part because I grew up in a family where my father was a very well-known, highly accomplished, and extremely rigorous and very honest and ethical scientist. And my mother, and who had, lots of kudos and recognition in his field, is what would be called nowadays a molecular immunologist at Columbia Medical School. And my mother was a painter and completely unknown. She never showed her paintings. She never had a show, an exhibition of her artwork, and she would never sell one. Even if guests came all the time to the house and admired her work, but she would never sell one because she loved them herself, and she didn't do it for fame or she did it because she loved the process in some sense. So I grew up in a family where my father saw with certain kind of eyes, and my mother saw and painted with very different kinds of eyes. And my eyes, when I was like even 3 or 4 or 5 years old, I could see that they were seeing with very different eyes, and that they were seeing different realities as because of that, and that they lived in different realities that sometimes they couldn't communicate how much they loved the reality they were living in. And I got that, I don't know how, but when I was very little. And so I think that what it did was in some sense expand my interest in what reality really was, because I could see it through the one vein, and I could see it through another view, another window, and it was like, but there can only be one reality, so how do you unify these discordant elements, as Wordsworth said, and make them move in one society, which is a few lines from the Preludes. So this has been something that and then I went into science because my father was a scientist, so, there's a certain kind of ambition and a sense that this is like really, really, really important stuff. And when you grow up in that kind of world, it's pretty much what you know. But the tempering of my mother and the way she saw the world, which is more like Monet, in terms of shadow, light, color, reflection, form that isn't exactly what a photograph would be by any stretch of the imagination, but you know what is being portrayed. That was an element of it, so I kind of majored in multiple subjects, chemistry and also comparative literature and stuff like that, although I didn't do that as a formal major, but that was what I was playing with, trying to understand poetry and music and so forth. So, and then when I was at MIT in molecular biology as a graduate student, I heard a talk by a man named Philip Kapleau, who maybe you cross paths with, but Philip Kapleau was actually a student of journalism at the Columbia School of Journalism in the 40s, and then was a reporter at the Nuremberg War Tribunal. And that had such a profound effect on him with the testimony that he was hearing that he went off to a Japanese monastery for 6 months in freezing cold Hokkaido in northern Japan, and told this story in his talk at MIT that he had all these medical problems, ulcers and anxiety and all sorts of things. And after 6 months of sitting in a freezing cold monastery in Japan, all those symptoms went away. And I'm sitting there. This seminar was invited by, he was invited to speak at MIT by Houston Smith, who was a professor of philosophy and religion.
Just passed away.
Really wonderful fellow who wrote a phenomenal book called The Religions of Man. So anyway, I saw
Which, by the way, I read at the age of 14.
Yeah. And it's a phenomenal book, and he revised it, but I would urge all of you to, you can learn a lot about humanity by reading Houston Smith's book. So I saw a sign on the walls at MIT saying, The Three Pillars of Zen, talk by Philip Kapleau at the invitation of Houston Smith. I didn't know who Philip Kapleau was. I didn't know who Houston Smith was. 1965. We were just starting with the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the Vietnam War, and I went to that talk at Seminar Hour at MIT. You know how many people were at that talk? Aside from Kapleau and Houston Smith and myself, maybe 2 or 3 other people. And the talk just blew my mind, and I was 21 years old at the time, and the thought that went through my mind is, this is what I've been looking for my entire life, which was only 21 years. But it had something to do with the sort of different ways of knowing, different epistemologies for understanding the one reality. So I started meditating that day, and very improbably, I just never stopped. And I started studying with various teachers and various traditions, and yoga and the Upanishads were a part of it, and I studied with various swamis and so forth, and you learn a lot from people. Over time, began to train more in the Buddhist tradition, and go on fairly extensive and quite rigorous meditation retreats. I know you were just telling me about one that you were in when you actually were in Thailand for a period of time and took vows as a monk. Is that right? And so these are very, very rigorous, very, very intense. And I describe meditation retreats as they're laboratories, just the way a neuroscience lab or a chemistry lab is. There are opportunities to actually investigate something of importance. So that's how I got into it. And then the love affair that I was speaking about yesterday was like, well, how could I find work or make work for myself, because I knew I wasn't going to find it in 1979. How could I make a job for myself where I could be meditating all the time, and they'd pay me to do it, and I could share this pure potentiality, so to speak, with other people who were hurting and really falling through the cracks and not having their needs met by medicine as it was being practiced, and was there something missing? And the last thing I'll say in terms of this is that I think I pointed to it yesterday. The words medicine and meditation are linked at the etymological hip. And you know where I learned that? I learned that from David Bohm, who was a quantum physicist who worked with Einstein and has this wonderful book that came out in 1980 called, what was it called? The Implicate Order.
The Implicate Order.
Yeah, and you probably saw it and read it at the same time. It's just a remarkable, different way of describing quantum physics and reality. So he points out in that book about physics that the words medicine and meditation are linked. And the way it works is that in Latin, the Latin root means to cure. So, that's the link. But the deep Indo-European root, which comes from, of course, the Indian subcontinent and Sanskrit, is, or Ur-Sanskrit, or some deep Indo-European root, is to measure. And he was saying, like, well, what could medicine and meditation possibly have to do with measure? And the answer is zero, nothing. If you think of measure as a standard of length or volume or whatever, and you're very judiciously mapping out how long the length of this carpet is or something like that. But what it's referring to is the more Platonic notion that everything has its own right inward measure. Okay? Every form that arises out of the formless has its own right inward measure. So medicine is the restoring of a dynamical right inward measure, what we call homeostasis or allostasis, when it's disrupted or disturbed. And what's meditation? Meditation is the direct perception of right inward measure. In other words, that you're already whole, you're already okay. No matter what's wrong with you, there's much more right with you, and can you sort of embrace the entirety of that? And that would be, and we could study this and investigate it, help people onto the glide path of greater healing and well-being, where healing, in my working definition, is not fixing or curing, but coming to terms with things as they are.
So few takeaways from that. Remembering is wholeness of that which was dismembered, right? To remember the fragmented aspect of being.
And sati, the word mindfulness in Sanskrit, sati, has an element of it that means remembering. So when we drop in, whether it's formal sitting meditation or whatever, when you're cultivating mindfulness, one element of it is to keep in mind, to remember what is arising, so that there's a sense of like growth and continuity from experience, rather than everything is like completely fragmented and there's no way to string things together. But that's not the entire meaning, but it has that root element of it. And then, well, I'll just leave it at that for now.
Few more insights from what he just said. It's just I'm remembering things. So, you know, in the non-dual traditions, they say when you see yourself in an object, the experience is beauty. When you see yourself in another person, the experience is love. So love and beauty go together.
Absolutely, and
Tagore
it runs in every culture. You know.
Yeah, in every culture. On David Bohm, here's a very interesting personal story. In 1980,
Wholeness in the Implicate Order was the name of the book.
Wholeness in the Implicate Order. So 1980, I saw a little ad in the New York Times that Krishnamurti was going to be speaking at the Felt Forum in Madison Square Garden. Didn't know who he was, except Indian.
Yeah.
I said, if an Indian is speaking...
With a very beautiful face, too.
With a beautiful face. So I said, if an Indian is speaking at Madison Square Garden, it must be a big event. So I still remember the day. It was around the 10th, 11th of January, freezing cold. It was snowing, light snow in New York, so it was very kind of harsh day. And people were waiting outside, and when the doors opened, 7,000 people walked into the door, the Felt Forum. And at precisely 9:15, when the lecture was going to start, we saw this person in a three-piece suit he used to wear. He was brought up in England, so he had an English accent. He used to wear a watch, etc. And he ran up the stairs and sat in a chair, which was even more, bare than this.
Oh yeah, a straight back chair.
Straight back chair,
right at the
right
edge
in
of
the front.
stage.
And people started to clap, and he kind of looked. He was a stern kind of person, and people started to clap. And he looked at the audience. He said, "Why are you clapping? If you want entertainment, Broadway is across the street." And then for 3 hours, nonstop, he spoke as if God was speaking the truth. And then suddenly he realized 3 hours were over. He put his watch back in his pocket and he rushed out. So then I started to research him. And I saw all the stuff that Aldous Huxley has written. But then I basically came across his conversations with David Bohm, the physicist. Now, Bohm has a very interesting history. He was kind of Anglo-American. He was a physicist, but he didn't participate in the atomic bomb process. Right. So he was labeled by the United States as a traitor, and he couldn't get a job. And Einstein actually found a job for him in Brazil, till after the war was over, etc. But Bohm and Krishnamurti became very good friends. And Bohm is known for that book, the implicate order and the holographic...
Wholeness in the implicate order.
Wholeness in the implicate order. And he's known for one of the interpretations of quantum physics, which is now called the pilot wave, which is having a resurgence right now, because nobody can agree on... And he talks about hidden variables.
Right.
Go ahead, you were going to say something.
Well, it strikes me that there's another connection that Houston Smith actually made a movie with Krishnamurti.
He did.
Houston Smith, this fellow who invited...
who just passed away, by the way, in his 90s.
Yeah. So Houston Smith did this movie with Krishnamurti, and when I was teaching biology at Brandeis, I was also teaching a science for non-science majors and really teaching meditation and yoga in that class. It was very popular. It's like the class was this size. We had to have it in the castle at Brandeis University. And the way Houston Smith did it is Houston Smith played the idiot. He just asked Krishnamurti these questions, and Krishnamurti, as you say, was very stern. So he would just turn on him and he'd say, "That is completely impossible. For God's sake, sir, can't you get this straight?" What I'm trying to convey. And it was like by making himself invisible, the way Bill Moyers also does, he brought Krishnamurti out in a way that was really rather fantastic. You may be able to find that movie on the internet, but when I was teaching at Brandeis, I actually went to MIT and asked Houston Smith, who I then told the whole story of being at his talk with Kaplow, if he would lend me the film so I could show it. And that was in the days before video was invented, so it was like a reel-to-reel kind of thing. If I could show it to my biology class at Brandeis. So there are all these kind of personal interconnections that I think are true for all of us. And one of the beauties of there's Krishnamurti, yeah. One of the beauties of this is that you never know who's in the audience. You never know who, I mean, this is its own non-localized field of profound intelligences, and we're all, in some sense, the cells of the one body, and also collaborating in a deep inquiry as to, how to make the most of our very evanescent and fleeting lives in ways that would align with what's deepest and best in us as human beings, rather than, the kind of contracted tendencies which get us into so much trouble. Oh,
so you
I don't know
can
how you
project
guys
that.
do this magic, but
produce,
that's
show that.
Actually, Houston Smith and Krishnamurti. How do you do it?
Renee is remarkable. So that's Krishnamurti, that's Houston Smith, who I met with Gorbachev in the early, when the what was it called? Perestroika was happening, Glasnost was happening.
Yeah.
And there he is. He was also an extraordinary person. Now, so to continue this story, because we're going to make a point at the end, okay, I became fascinated with Krishnamurti, who then passed away in 1985, actually, at the age of 90. So there was no way to get to him. But through my readings, I found that Aldous Huxley's widow was in Los Angeles. Laura Huxley. Mm-hmm. And so I tracked her down. And by then she was in her late 70s, but the story is that she was 19 years, and these are recollections, so you may have to do your own search, but the story is that she was 19 or 20 when she read Brave New World, and she decided she fell in love with Aldous Huxley, who was then in California, and she was in Switzerland just by reading his book. And then she came and actually literally seduced him into marrying her. And they had an amazing life together, and they were very close to Krishnamurti. And so she regaled me with all these stories about Krishnamurti and Aldous Huxley and Henry Miller. And then through a series of happy accidents, I ended up in the Krishnamurti School, Brockton Park in England, where I met Mrs. Bohm, who's, by the way, still alive. She's in her 90s and she's living in Israel. And then she told me all these stories about Bohm and how he was basically a pariah because he didn't cooperate with the atomic bomb, etc., etc. But coming back to what you were saying about your father and your mother, by the way, the same thing with my parents. My father was a cardiologist, a very science-based cardiologist. At one time, he was a cardiologist to the royal family in England. He was a consultant to the Royal Heart Hospital. He described high-altitude pulmonary edema, the first one to describe it. What happens when you go to during the Chinese and Indian War, he went to Leh while people were killing each other. He was putting catheters and measuring pulmonary artery pressures. So he was a very strict scientist. But my mother was a storyteller, and all these mythical stories. And it wasn't until very late, in life that my father actually embraced consciousness in a very big way, much more than I did, because he saw the effect it had had. But the question is...
So through your influence?
Yeah, through my influence. In the beginning, he said, "What are you doing? I sent you to medical school."
Wasting your entire life.
But slowly, I kind of introduced him, and I took him to meet Maharishi, etc. And he was just taken by the presence of some of the people that he met. But talking about story and your construct and entanglement, since we talk about thoughts and feelings and emotions, and even our perceptions, aren't they in a sense entangled within the story that we have created of what is reality? So that story, in a sense, influences how not only do we perceive, but how we feel and the thought structures we come up with, and and in the end, how we explore reality.
Yeah, I agree. But the stories themselves, it's really interesting. The sort of dual slit experiment. That the electrons don't go, the photons don't go through one slit; they'll go through two slits, except when the wave function collapses. And so that's also true for stories. I would say, at least metaphorically, that I could have told you that story about just my childhood 100 different ways, depending on the effect I wanted to have, and there are different elements of it and so forth. It's actually very, very complex, as is true for all of us. So there's a certain way in which all of our stories, it seems to me, all of the narratives are pointing to a narrative that's sort of no longer a narrative. It's just a container for all narrative, which is a lot like, say, the Feynman diagrams where, the electron's, trajectory, or whatever the elementary particle is, it goes by virtually an infinite number of different paths. And so our narratives are really an infinite number of different paths that don't necessarily explain anything until you take the whole into account. That's a very sort of heady way of saying that it's important to sort of really love our stories, but not believe that they're absolutely true. And to really keep in mind that that it's possible to drop underneath the story to wherever the generating of story comes from, and there's a deep beauty there that you, as I've been listening to you're naming in some sense pure awareness or pure consciousness or something like that, whatever you call it. And that is a trustworthy human experience for us. And so it's healing to actually drop underneath the stories and not be too attached to them, because in some sense, as we know, the sort of one of the root causes of suffering is attachment and identification with those naughty personal pronouns we were talking about, I, me, and mine. And it struck me, I didn't say this in my talk yesterday, but the Buddha is famous for having said, and he taught nonstop for 45 years. He's famous for having said all of his teachings could be encapsulated in one sentence. And I like to say, on the off chance he wasn't just joking, that maybe we should memorize that sentence, even if we don't understand it. You get 45 years worth of Buddhist, transcendent wisdom, one sentence. So what is the sentence? Nothing is to be clung to. The operative verb is to cling. Nothing is to be clung to as I, me, and mine.
So 2 questions. One is, since you brought up the suffering, and yesterday you did talk about the silent sermon, right?
Yes.
That you remember?
Mahakashapa.
You remember the story?
The Buddha holding up the flower.
So, and then only one person smiled. So that was the famous disciple by the name of Ananda. He was like the bright guy in the class. And one of the versions that comes down, which is frequently, at least talked about in India, is everyone else was confused because only Ananda got the transmission. So they went to him. Something happened. You and the Buddha seem to have some deep special connection. All we saw was a flower. What did you see, Ananda? And he said, I saw the flower, but I also saw rainbows and sunshine and earth and water, the wind and the air. I saw the infinite void. I saw the whole universe in that flower. That's a sudden shift in perspective. Just in that silent transmission.
And didn't Blake write a little poem about
That's right.
See the universe in a grain of sand.
Yeah.
World in the wildflower.
Yeah, and the world
Hold
in
infinity in the palm of your hand.
Right.
Universe in an hour. Or eternity in an hour.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah, and even there, you see, I told the story as it being Mahakashapa who saw it, because that's the way the Zen people told it. But then the same story, but someone else had the experience. So there's a perfect example of how it's a story. Nobody that we know is actually there to report it. And then some people nowadays would call it fake news anyway.
I would say all news is fake news.
Well, exactly. In a certain way, I think this whole conversation around, fake news and what is real, it's not just problematic. It's actually pointing to a kind of potential for us as a society to mature to the point where we realize that whenever anything is framed, it's like long before there was Donald Trump. I mean, people used to say all the time, don't believe everything you read in the newspaper. You know why? Because a lot of it's not true. It's a particular kind of angle that even with the best of intentions, the most authentic and ethical journalists, they will tell the story a certain way, but they don't have all the facts and so forth.
It's their perspective too. Isn't one of the eightfold teachings is right view?
Exactly.
And that right view is either no view or all views.
Exactly. And this what you're talking about, for those of you not familiar with it, is that the Buddha's first teaching after his full awakening experience was a teaching that he gave to 5 people called the Four Noble Truths, or the Four Ennobling Truths. And they were in the form of maybe I said this yesterday, did I? I think they were in the form of a medical diagnosis. The first noble truth is the diagnosis. And this is often misrepresented as, they say, life is suffering. That is not what the Buddha said. The Buddha did not say life is suffering. The Buddha said there is the question of suffering, and it needs to be addressed. So that's the diagnosis, there is this thing called suffering. That's the ailment diagnosis. So what's the etiology? What is the source of the disease? And the source of the disease is what I just quoted: clinging, identification, grasping. Okay? So that's very contemporary. To look at the opioid epidemic, look at how attached we are to our devices. I mean, we are, sort of clinging desperately to our own view, and of course, discounting all other views that don't coincide with our own. So what's the third is the prognosis. And the prognosis is excellent from the Buddhist point of view. Prognosis is there is the possibility of liberation from suffering in the form of greed, hatred, delusion, and so forth. And then what you're pointing to is the fourth noble truth, which is called the Eightfold Noble Path, and right view is one of the eight, right mindfulness the first. And there are so these 8 path factors, and that is the treatment plan. You instantiate the Eightfold Path, you practice, you exercise the muscle, as we were talking about yesterday, and that, oh my God, you've got the Eightfold Noble. You guys are good, the 4 noble. So all this is really to say that that the stories and the narratives that we tell each other could be really, really valuable as long as we don't get into the sort of self-identification with them as being the absolute truth. And there's something about the unknowability that is, you know, in some sense, part of the beauty of entanglement, and we just it's not necessarily possible for us to understand everything, but maybe we will. And I just want to, since you spoke so much about quantum physics and gravity and the early Einstein and so forth, maybe we should pay homage to the fact you mentioned it in passing, that one of the most amazing things that humanity has done was actually develop these 2 detectors for the gravitational waves. They just won the Nobel Prize for it in physics a couple of weeks ago. But they built 2 gigantic vacuum thermos bottles, okay, like 2.5 miles long, the biggest thermos bottles in the world, that actually are the greatest vacuum that has ever been created on the planet. It's like meant to sort of imitate outer space. And they have mirrors and lasers, and basically what it is that they are measuring a wiggle in space. If there is a wiggle in space, the distance between the mirrors will change, and then the laser light will get there faster, and you can coordinate this in such a way that... And so if you had one detector and you got a hiccup that you identified as a wiggle in space, of course nobody would believe it, because you say, how do you know it's not an artifact? So they built 2 detectors 2,000 miles apart, one in Washington State and one near New Orleans, and they got the hiccup at the very same moment. And they could actually triangulate where the source of the hiccup was, and I don't know how they do this, but they could basically define that there were like 2 gigantic black holes that collided 1 billion years ago.
200 billion years.
200, thank you. Yeah. 200 billion years ago.
Isn't that wild?
And let's see. No, it couldn't be 200 billion because the universe is only 13.8 billion.
200 million years ago.
Okay.
We can look it up.
Whatever. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
What is the...
This gigantic of like 100 solar masses, 30 solar masses, 60 solar masses colliding, setting off the biggest energy vibration, in the neighborhood a long time ago, and then we're detecting it as a little rivulet, a little wavelet in not light, but space itself, that is smaller than like 1/10,000th the width of an electron. So you know how many names were on that paper? How many names of physicists and engineers and scientists to pull that off? There were 1,000 names on the paper. So my point is, whether you think that's a good use of our money or not, that human beings could actually get together and collaborate, and building the technology to do that kind of thing is beyond mind-blowing. And it's one of the sort of ways in which I mentioned like the potential for a renaissance flowering on the earth, a global renaissance, that the science and the technology and the art and the beauty and the music and the poetry and the deep inquiry as to the nature of our humanity that you are teaching and embodying, I mean, all of that has the potential to come together and really heal what so much needs healing on this planet at this moment. And
Wasn't
soon, not like 1,000 years from now, because we may not have 1,000 years.
Wasn't that replicated also second time? That the
Yeah, so
gravity-
now they've had hiccups, like, it turns out the universe is hiccuping all the time, because these masses, these unthinkably large, if you start thinking about black holes, you will lose your mind, and luckily you don't know enough math, at least I don't know enough math, to really understand it, but it is mind-blowing to think about the nature of gravity when it is so strong that light itself cannot escape from it. And they talk about wormholes into different universes. And now, of course, there's no one universe. There's like multiverses and actually different orders of multiple universes. So if that's true, then, maybe it's okay for us to really say that there are hidden dimensions to our own experience, not just to other physical realities, but what about the hidden dimension of this moment? That's like a hidden dimension for most of us. What if we reclaimed that dimension of being human? It's like a hidden dimension. Let's see if we could inhabit that and see what the proximal effects of that would be in terms of health, well-being, sanity, doing the right thing, non-harming, and not getting into all that selfing, othering, and ussing that leads to so much violence.
So, John, couple of things. But by the way, your talk, you just mentioned multiverses. There's a stanza in Yoga Vaishishta where the seer speaking to Ram, which I mentioned yesterday, he says, infinite universes come and go in the vast expanse of consciousness, like motes of dust shining through a beam of light. What a great image, huh?
Absolutely. And so those insights, long before there were LIGO detectors and gravity waves and quantum physics, where those insights were arrived at through this, through non-doing, through dropping in and opening into the nature of your own mind, thousands of years ago, and then written down in those scriptures. And so there's something going on that we are, in some sense, the inheritors of, and harking back to memory, we talk about reminding ourselves. Why can't we rebody ourselves in English too? Moment by moment.
So, along your journey now, from the age of 21 to now,
73.
And many more to come. Along this journey, you've seen the unfolding of the science behind mindfulness. A lot of people aren't totally familiar with that, but your work as a professor at University of Massachusetts and all these other institutions, engagement with the Mind Life Institute, with His Holiness and other luminaries in this field. Where are we now with the science of mindfulness? Both biologically and the benefits that you already talked about. I mean, we should...
Two of my longest-term friends, closest friends, Daniel Goleman and Richie Davidson, who I've known ever since they were graduate students at Harvard in psychology, just wrote a book. It came out last month called Altered Traits, which is about how to parse all of the enormity of the scientific studies on mindfulness now and drill down to what the essence of it is. Because a lot of the science is, science, some of it's more rigorous than others, some of it stands the light of day better than others. And what they did was very rigorously go through the entire literature and abstract the sort of most reliable data. And I think the first thing to say is the science is still in its infancy, so what we don't know is far bigger than what we do know. But that there are two things that I think put a lot of confidence in. One is they've taken people with up to 60,000 hours of meditative practice, And that usually comes in, we're not going to have 60,000 hours to spend in, a monastery or cave or, on retreat. But people have, and Richie has brought them into his lab at the University of Wisconsin over a number of years with the collaboration and help of the Dalai Lama, and studied their brains and their various practices. And this kind of elucidation of their brains are just different from ours. And it's an example of how, what I was talking yesterday about neuroplasticity, when you actually practice like this, you are driving functional connectivity. You're connecting up different regions of the brain in ways that's what the brain is designed to do. But when you exercise the muscle with certain kind of rigor over days, weeks, months, years, and decades, you have a very different brain, and you can just see the colors, the brain scans of the monastics versus the brain scans of kids who are sophomores, at the University of Wisconsin or someplace, having had 2 weeks of meditation instruction. They're all blue, and these are like red and yellow, and you can see right away different brains. And interestingly enough, a lot of those brains, they're that way even when they're not meditating, because at a certain point, as I was trying to suggest yesterday, there's no separation between life and meditation. So that's why it's called altered traits, that it's not like you do this and you go into some special magical state, and then for that period of time you're a wise person, then you get up and you yell at your kids, or you sort of yell at somebody who cuts you off on the freeway or whatever, and you're the same old schlep you always were. But that the suggestion is that if you practice long enough, you change your being. Or I would say more differently, you reclaim who you really are. And then the other element of their book that they point out is that a lot of the studies of MBSR and MBCT are really trending in the direction of like robust enough so that we can really have confidence that those particular ways of training people in mindfulness are valid, and they result in these kinds of changes at the level of the immune system, at the level of epigenetics, at the level of neuroplasticity, telomeres and telomerase. I know you've done some work with Alyssa Eppel and Liz Blackburn from UCSF about that. So there's a certain sense in which this stuff is now believable in a way that it might not have been at the beginning. Another book that I might recommend to you is called The Craving Mind. Remember I talked about nothing is to be clung to as I, me, and mine, the Buddha said. So my colleague Judd Brewer, who used to be at Yale and is now the head of the Center for Mindfulness at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, he's a neuroscientist who just wrote this book called The Craving Mind, and he does some really remarkable, what's called real-time neurofeedback, where you can see how advanced meditators, or let's not call them advanced meditators, but people who've been at it for a while versus people who are just starting. It's like you can see on screens how easily our own mind gets enthusiastic and involved with thinking, and then everything kind of goes south from there, that you contract into your own ordinary conditions of daily living. But when you let go and really forget about accomplishing anything or making anything happen, then you see these signals that really support, through the biofeedback process, or the feedback process, a sense of like, it is a non-doing. The more you get in the way, the more doing, the more judging, the more evaluating, the more you say, yippee, I made it go blue, the more it goes red. So you can learn from that that all of the guided meditation instructions that are so inviting of us just being with what is, as opposed to... So there's no such thing as like Olympic athlete meditators. Sometimes they use that kind of terminology, but it's not like if we were really good, we would practice that long and then we'd be like them. You're never going to be like the Dalai Lama, Mother Teresa, Deepak Chopra, or whoever else is your guru of the moment. The best any of us can do is to be who we already are and be that in our fullness. And that's doable. That's practicable. And otherwise, we just put people on pedestals that are far beyond our reach, and then you can get discouraged because it's like, well, I don't have 60,000 hours to practice this, and besides, I can hardly stay on my cushion for 2 seconds. you know. So I think the bottom line is that, first of all, the science is driving this, but even if there were no science, and I say this in the revised version of Full Catastrophe Living, even if there was no science at all about mindfulness, I'd still be doing it because of what I heard in that room with Houston Smith and Philip Kapleau. And it's like, it blew my mind. It's not like, oh, I'll make nice fMRIs 40 years from now, you know, by nice patterns on fMRIs. No, nobody goes into mindfulness or meditation for that. They go into it for the potential liberation from greed, hatred, delusion, and ignorance. And that we're all capable of. And it really is a love affair. And I think you can see that just from hearing the way Deepak is parsing reality, so to speak, that these are really all, in some sense, modes of encouragement for us to ground ourselves in the actuality of being rather than be deluded by certain kinds of stories that may be true to a certain degree, but they're not big enough and they're not true enough.
I love your phrase. What is it? Dropping down? What's the phrase you use? Huh?
I don't know.
Dropping in.
Dropping in.
I love it because, it immediately creates the experience.
When I did Richie and I did a study together, the first randomized clinical trial of MBSR, where I commuted out to Madison, Wisconsin for 10 weeks and led this MBSR program, not in a hospital, but in a high-tech bioengineering company, where we did the first randomized clinical trial. And I was really worried. There were like millions of dollars riding on this study, and it was funded by the MacArthur Foundation, and Richie was a member of the MacArthur Mind-Body Network in those days. So I thought, how am I going to actually teach this in a way that we won't be studying how good people are at trying to meditate? As opposed to really meditating, because why would we be interested in people trying to be still, or to get, to some different, special, better state? So I brought along a tennis ball. I was sort of just grasping at straws, so I grasped that tennis ball, and from time to time, when I was teaching the meditation, I would drop the tennis ball and just encourage people to drop into the present moment. So you could say, in a certain way, it's like there's a kind of hypnotic suggestion here that you just stop and drop. Okay? Drop.
Do that anytime, right? Anytime.
Anytime, in any moment, under any conditions. The world is kind of really a better place when we're here for it than when we check out. And that doesn't mean that you can't relax or, so binge watch this or that, or just go mindless for periods of time. But when you're mindful of how mindless you are, which is what happens, that's the basic meditation practice, is how mindful you are. The first thing you notice is how mindless you are. That then it really takes root in a way that is not about getting someplace else, as was said, but about being where you already are, but being here in your fullness, which is what the universe really, I wouldn't say just asks of us, but so sorely needs of us, in fact. And just the one last thing, because when you talk, so many interesting thoughts move through my mind. The sort of, Einstein had something to say about human beings, to bring all the quantum physics and the entanglement down to Earth. And you're right, Einstein could never accept even quantum reality. He said God doesn't play dice, He could never accept that there was a kind of indeterminacy in the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and so forth. He's like, how could that be? But, I was born long enough ago, so I remembered Einstein while he was alive. And everybody related to him kind of like the way maybe you experience people relating to Muhammad Ali in his heyday. I mean, he was like the champ, you know. So Einstein was definitely the smartest man in the world. So people used to write to him from all over the world with their personal problems. And the interesting thing is, Einstein used to write back. You know, it's like you'd think, no, I'm busy, you know, but he would write back. And so I read this in the New York Times one day in the early 70s, that a rabbi had written to Einstein. So this is a kind of a religious person. Rabbi had written to Einstein asking for advice on what to say to his 19-year-old daughter over the death of her 16-year-old sister, as he put it, a sinless, beautiful child. So this is a religious person asking Einstein for advice about something that usually you'd ask a religious person for, right? And Einstein replied in the most remarkable way. He starts out because his mind, he was not an experimentalist. He was a theoretical physicist. So he probably couldn't have put two electrodes together, but he could put thoughts together and get involved in these Gedanken experiments. So he unified space and time, and he unified matter and energy. So he wrote back, a human being, this is what his reply to the rabbi, a human being is a part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space, at least relatively speaking. He experiences, and you can put she in if you like, but this is the way, he experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and affection for a few persons nearest us. Remember, he's writing about the death of his own daughter. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by, get this, widening our circle of compassion and embracing the whole of nature in its beauty. Nobody is able to do this, but the embracing of such an intention is the source of liberation and the foundation for inner security. When I read that in 1974, having my coffee at the Harvard Medical School, I basically fell on the floor. I mean, because that could have been written by, you know, a rishi or a sage or the Buddha. And here's Einstein, the father of, you know, the sort of unification of, you know, universal forces in the universe, talking about us being a part of all that and talking about liberation, compassion, and inner security. I mean, it's like, you don't find that happening all that much. And it really knocked my socks off.
Here's my version of the same story. I was 12 years old, and I wanted, you know, in my school, which was a all-boys school, there was one kid who was just an amazing writer, and I admired him more. I wanted to be like him. And so I always wanted to be a writer. But my father, being a scientist, wanted me to go into medicine. So on my 14th birthday, he gave me a number of books. And they were all about writers, novelists, but they were also doctors. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I was enamored of being a writer and a doctor. Beautiful. But then he gave me a book by a Russian cosmonaut, or there weren't any cosmonauts, but he gave me a book by some Russian science writer on Einstein explaining the theory of relativity. And I read it.
How old were you?
12 or 14. But I didn't understand it, except that I happened to find, and it's still there on the internet, you'll find it, a picture of Einstein with Charlie Chaplin. And I said, this guy must be something else, you know, if he can hang out with Charlie Chaplin, because he used to have these black and white jerky movies. And then what happened is, as I started to go deeper, talking about poetry, I was exposed in my early childhood and through my teenage years to the Indian poet Tagore.
Tagore, yeah.
Tagore won the Nobel Prize in 1928 because W.B. Yeats, who was an Irish poet, helped Tagore translate his poems into English.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's how he got the Nobel Prize. And then Einstein somewhere read these poems. And he invited Tagore to come and visit him in a place called Potsdam, outside of Berlin, because he was totally taken with the poems. And so, as Tagore walked into that room, and this is, by the way, all reported now. It's in my book too, in the first chapter of You Are the Universe, but you can find it on the internet, and the New York Times reported it too. Einstein and Tagore met, and they were in awe of each other. And one was a poet at that time who was relatively unknown, just becoming known. The other was the most famous scientist in the world. And so Einstein says to Tagore, there are two versions of reality. One is the scientific version, and then he points to Tagore and he says the other is the humanist version. And Tagore says, but the scientific version is that of the scientific human being. And so he says, I agree with you on your idea of beauty, but I don't agree with you on your idea of fundamental reality. And they talk for about 15 minutes till Einstein says, my religion is science. My religion is science, which means he's saying, I'm putting my faith in something that I cannot prove, which is an observer-independent reality. So last year, with some people, at the center and some friends, I went to Einstein's library in Israel at the Hebrew University. Mm-hmm. And all these conversations are there. And they're unknown to the world. It's so interesting that they're there in this Hebrew University library with all these pictures and these conversations between poet and scientist. And what I think I'm hoping we are seeing right now is a renaissance of where poetry and art and music and literature and the humanities and the sciences come together in a friendly dialogue, so we can see the emergence of a new paradigm.
I would love that.
Show that. Show that. Okay, that's Albert Einstein, Charlie Chaplin. Do you have a picture of Tagore and Einstein too? So he says, Einstein says to Charlie Chaplin, but your fame is even greater. The world admires you when nobody understands you, he says to Einstein.
Beautiful.
This whole dialogue can be summarized in that Frank Sinatra jingle, doobie doobie doo. One's about being and the other's about doing. You have a picture? Yeah, that's...
Oh, yeah, that's a famous picture.
Yeah, so that's in the Einstein library. Tagore, the poet, the sage, the rishi, and Einstein, the sage of
just
science.
To say, it's said that Einstein wasn't that much fun to live with. So, I think it's really important, again, we've said it before, but to not reify somebody into a caricature of who they were just because of their accomplishments. Their accomplishments are profound, and we should be able to draw deeply, deeply on them, but not in some sense lose ourselves in the worshiping of some other, which is never going to be actually the truth. And there's always sort of hidden elements of it. So the way I frame that is, because it's inevitable, even under these kinds of circumstances, that, when there are like the sages on the stages, so to speak, as they sometimes put it, that there's inevitably certain projections that sort of come up, to whoever's on the stage. It's like, and it's very important to be aware of those, to be mindful of how much you think someone else is there and you need to get there or something like that. And that the most important thing is to dive as deeply as you care to into the teachings. And it's much more about the teachings than it is about the teachers. And the more we can remember that even as teachers, then I think the more we can thread the sort of ethical kind of embodiment of what's deepest and best in all of us, without creating the sort of separation that very often leads to, highly respected, well-known people who, are supposed to be enlightened and should know better and everything else, to just crash and burn. And I think that if this is going to become a kind of distributive flowering leading to the kind of renaissance we're talking about, it can only happen if every single one of us takes responsibility for the whole. And I don't mean just the whole United States. I mean the whole universe in a certain way, or the whole of our infinite understanding. And something you said this morning, that if you just look for the center of your own awareness, will you find it? Don't answer, but just look. And if you look for the circumference or the periphery or the edge of your own awareness, will you find it? So, in a sense, we are, infinite beings. And Einstein was right. We are part of the whole called by us universe. But that part, he says, is limited in time and space, but there's a certain way in which it's not limited beyond time and beyond space. And the present moment, everything you've been pointing to, is really a kind of doorway into some other dimensionality that may be the best way for us human beings to reclaim the name that we gave ourselves as a species that I spoke about yesterday, and really be, as the Marines like to say, I think it's the Marines recruiting statement, be all you can be. I don't know what ad firm they paid for that and how much they paid, but that's not a bad idea, is to, be all you can be. Maybe that's the love affair, maybe that's the swadharma, maybe that's the engagement that we're all some kind of non-localized part of some larger entangled foment.
And if you're reifying somebody, then just talk to their wife or the kids. Right?
Yep.
Whoever that is. By the way, Tagore is known. He used to live outside of Calcutta, and the family, very distinguished family, they had little boats on the Hubli River, and Tagore would stop the boatman once in a while and just drop in, as you say, for hours, just there in being. So, thank you, John. Thank you.
Deepak, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.